Good evening. Good evening and welcome to you all. For those of you who do not know me, my name is Rao. Our full name is R.V. Srinivas Rao, popularly known as Rao. I'm the chairperson for the Qatar branch, and along with all my committee members here, we welcome you to this lovely event, Procuring Sme Services. This is going to be a very interesting session where we have got signature series for all the events being conducted in Qatar in collaboration with Qatar Development Bank. Let me tell you a little bit about Qatar Development Bank. And before that, Mr. Mohammed, thank you so much for attending the session. We welcome you on behalf of CIPS Qatar branch and also the MENA itself. Qatar Development Bank is fully funded by State of Qatar and it's headquartered in Doha. It is a wing of Ministry of Finance, and it is its main aim is to develop and diversify economic and industrial investments in the state of Qatar. The bank finances small and medium enterprises, encourages the entrepreneur abilities as well to increase the production within Qatar, and also it approaches large organizations trying to persuade them to go for the local sourcing itself. It is a good move, definitely, as we speak about the sustainability and all. So this also is part of the corporate social responsibility where we can really invest within the state itself. That's a little bit about Qatar Development Bank. And they are the main sponsor for our events being conducted by CIPS Qatar branch. This evening, we have a very good speaker with us, Mr. Sam Achampol. Mr. Sam is very popular. He is the regional head and general manager for the CIPS. Sam does not need introduction. Many of you know him, and he's a very, very strong advocate to the professional standards of procurement and supply chain management. And just before I hand over to Sam, I would like to tell you that our committee members and I, we volunteer for it, and all of us, we work on separate jobs. So this is only a voluntary activity, and there will be elections coming up towards the end of the year, and we would request you to nominate yourself. There'll be separate email, I think, already sent by Mr. Hariharan. So please go through that email as well and nominate yourself. Without wasting much of the time, I would hand over now to Mr. Sam Achampol to take us through this lovely session on procuring SME services. Mr. Sam, over to you. Sorry, Sam, and before that, any questions, please use the question and answer chat box. We are there to answer you. If you're unable to answer you now, we will definitely write you an email as well. So please, Sam, over to you, please.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rao. Thanks for that introduction. I reiterate and pass on our thanks again to Qatar Development Bank. Thank you all for attending. You're all very, very welcome to this, the latest in our series. And as Rao said, yes, if you have any questions as we're going along, please do not hesitate to write them in the Q&A box below. We will make sure we address any questions you have at all. So what we're going to talk about today is procuring SME services, and all of our series, obviously all of our webinars are all about procurement in any way. And the reality is that should there be a different way to procure services or products for SMEs? Should there be a different way? The reality is actually when you're procuring products or services, there shouldn't really be a different way to deal with a different segment of industry or whatever else. But there are specific nuances when you're making that decision to procure SME services. And I guess that's why we have this session today, to talk about those nuances, to talk about those differences. There aren't that many, but they are important differences, and they will help both SMEs to get work with large corporates, to be successful in tenders, and it will also help large corporates or government entities to understand how to be more successful in working with SMEs. So that's what the session's all about. And as I say, if you do have any questions as we go along, please do not hesitate to ask those questions. Now, in terms of procurement, I think, as I said before, and as I always say, and I always come back to the fundamentals, is let's just make sure we're all on the same page. Let's all understand what we're talking about here. We always make that statement and say, what is procurement? What procurement is doesn't change whether you're speaking about SMEs or corporates or governments. Procurement is procurement. And there's a perception of procurement, and there's the reality of what procurement really is. And sometimes the perception looks a little bit like this. Sometimes the perception is that procurement is just about doing what the individuals in this picture are doing, which is being at the right place at the right time, and being able to have access to the right price, as they're doing here because they're attending an annual sale. So that is the perception of what procurement is, and the only thing that procurement is. But in reality, procurement does represent a perpetual juggling of priorities, and that's what procurement officers do. Procurement managers are always in the function of juggling their priorities, because it's not only about being at the right place, it's not only about being able to get the right quantity of goods or the right quality. You have to juggle those priorities, and that's what professional procurement starts to define. Because, as we know, looking at the little poster that we've inserted in this slide below, you cannot have a win-win scenario with procurement. If you want something of a high quality for a lower price, you're going to have to compromise on the delivery or logistics of that item. If you want something to be delivered very fast of a high quality, then it's unlikely to be of the lowest price. So there's a perpetual juggling of that statement that says procurement is all about obtaining the right price and the right quality at the right time, et cetera, et cetera. So procurement officers, procurement professionals need to be a little bit more savvy than just being at the right place, obtaining things for the right price and the right quality, quantity, and at the right time. So there's a little bit more sophistication in there. And in fact, the definition of procurement always looks like this, and it talks about a function that is a strategic value contributor to an organization, a commercial advisor to an organization, and is populated with professionals who have skills to deliver business outcomes. So fully qualified, trained and experienced procurement professionals are not just individuals who are able to purchase something for the lowest price available on the market. They're actually people who are able to interpret the business requirements using their emotional intelligence in a commercially savvy way to deliver business outcomes. And business outcomes will have to take into account all the factors and all of those balls that we're juggling in the air. Sustainability, stakeholder management, value creation, ethics, all of these things, including supplier relationship management, including the formation of your contracts, including the categories of spend you're dealing with, are fundamental to how effective your procurement function is. So that just defines procurement and puts us all on the same page. Procurement and its definition does not change whether you're dealing with SMEs or corporates. Procurement done in a strategic way is always the definition of the acts and actions involved in obtaining goods and services for the lowest, not for the lowest price, but for the lowest total cost of ownership. So that brings us all on the same page, and that's what we're talking about. But the nuance here is obviously we're going to apply this to SMEs and see if there's any difference. Now, when organizations or individuals are delivering procurement, it's always delivered in accordance with what we call the procurement cycle. So in broad terms, this is the procurement cycle. 13 steps where any organization or individual, when they're wanting to procure something, whether it's a good or service, they take these 13 steps into account. The procurement cycle is the foundation, the bedrock of everything you do in your procurement function. So it's the fundamental process for any buying activity. So any buying activity takes these factors into account. Now, the procurement cycle, as you can see here, is relevant to all organizational spend. Doesn't matter what you're procuring, the cycle is relevant. Starting from understanding what your need is, understanding what the market commodity is, putting a strategy together, going further to looking at the pre-procurement activities, developing suppliers, selecting suppliers, issuing a tender or an RFQ or RFP or whatever you want to call it, to awarding a contract, to the logistics surrounding obtaining that product, to the storage of that product, to managing the contract performance, supplier relationship management, and also managing that asset, if it's an asset you're procuring, are all part of the procurement cycle. So in other words, whatever you're procuring, you need to have an understanding or an appreciation for all of these factors before you decide to go ahead and procure. Now, the steps in there are 13 of them, will obviously depend on the category of spend that you're dealing with. Now, some organizations will think, or some individuals will think, you won't need to have an appreciation for the procurement strategy if you're buying something very, very transactional. If you're buying a pen, for example, would you need to look at the procurement cycle? Well, the answer is you would need to have an appreciation for it. You would need to start. You'll need to at least understand the need and look at the market or commodity before you decide to even purchase the most fundamental items. Because if you don't do that, if we go back to the example of pens, you may look back in 2 years' time and find out that actually you're spending $1 million reals buying pens across the organization because you didn't appreciate how much you're spending. You didn't appreciate who buys pens, what quality they buy, whether they're stored arbitrarily. So you do need to, before you put a strategy of procurement together, understand what your commodity is. That's very important. But the steps, the 13 steps in the procurement cycle, whether you adhere to all of them will depend on the category of spend. And also, the procurement organizational strategy will define which steps you use and how those steps are implemented. And that depends what type of organization you are, whether you're an IT company, you could be an automotive company, you could be a medical supplier, you could be an aviation company. So that the type of organization you're with will depend on how you apply the procurement cycle to your business. And it will depend on the maturity of your organization, and it will depend on what your actual strategy is. Is your organization on the acquisition trail? Are you actually looking to significantly cut costs, save costs? Are you looking to gain new market share? You'd have to actually appreciate what the organization's strategy is before applying the organizational strategy, because the organizational strategy overrides whatever the procurement strategy is. And actually, in reality, the two should sit very well together. They should complement each other and shouldn't cancel each other out. But the organizational strategy always overrides whatever your procurement strategy is. And this gives you a brief example of what I'm talking about. So what I'm saying here is that you'll have a procurement strategy, and these are some of the steps you'll have in a procurement strategy. Procurement strategy may say, look, we have a procurement team, we have a procurement function here, and our aim here is to make sure the organization achieves the lowest commercial price in any commodity, product, or service we buy. So that will be an element of your procurement strategy. An element of your procurement strategy may also be, we need to make sure that whatever services we're getting are, from a quality perspective, the best services on the market. Okay, so those are some of the components of a procurement strategy. An organization strategy will be a little bit more strategic than that. Your organization, from a strategic perspective, will be looking to maximize maybe your brand value, your brand ethos, your standing in the marketplace, ensuring that your organization is a sustainability in the long run, that you have longevity in the organization, that you're profitable, and that you're living the organization's values. So the organization strategy will be looking more at the brand value and how sustainable the business is. The procurement strategy will be looking at more commoditized or specific things based on procurement. Now, the reality is that the procurement strategy will change depending on what the organizational strategy is. And what do I mean by that? Let's take one category of spend, marketing, for example. Now, if the procurement strategy is to save money, then you need to make sure that that is aligned with the organizational strategy. Because if you look at a category of spend like marketing, you will not be going out on the market trying to get the cheapest engagement with a brand or marketing company if your organization is on the acquisition trail, if your organization is looking to maximize your brand value, because you would actually need to be looking really for the best marketing agency, not the cheapest. Okay, so that's a very basic example. But the key thing here is, if procurement are saving money, and a lot of money, on marketing contracts, for example, but the organization's main aim is to grow their brand presence, then the two strategies are not aligned. So they'll need to be aligned to make sure you have an overarching strategy. So they need to be aligned, but the organization strategy always overrides. So ultimately, as you can see down the bottom in green, both your procurement strategy and your organization strategy ultimately are looking to generate value. Okay, as well as revenue, they're looking to generate organizational value. So that just gives you a broad basis of where procurement sits within an organization. And as we move on, let's appreciate one thing in terms of how an organization interacts with third parties. The vast majority of any organization spend is with third-party suppliers or service providers. So the vast majority of whatever we spend as an organization, if you take away maybe the wages of your staff, the payroll, everything else, the vast majority of everything else is spent with third-party suppliers, whatever that category of spend is. So it could be facilities management, where you're looking after your buildings and the running of your facilities. It could be with the IT hardware or services that you're maintaining. It could be consumables. It could be marketing services, as I mentioned before. It could be what you spend with your lawyers, your legal advisors, your panels of legal service providers. It could be consultants. So the vast majority of what your organization spends is with third parties. But the reality here is that, as it says at the top, corporates, or the larger that corporate organization is, the larger the third-party supplier they tend to deal with. So what do I mean by that? If you are, okay, well, we're in the era of the leading organizations in this particular era are healthcare companies, medical suppliers. Let's take Pfizer, for example. Okay, Pfizer are doing very well at the moment. So Pfizer as an organization, being a global multinational organization, if you look at their categories of spend, let's talk about facilities management, for example. Pfizer, being a global multinational company, lots of money, operating in a multitude of countries, when they're talking about facilities management, they do not use a local facilities management company. So if you're Pfizer in Jordan, if you're Pfizer in London, if you're Pfizer in Doha, you have a number of buildings there. Maybe you have a head office, maybe you have a smaller facility. But the reality is that you are not using a local facilities management company to deliver your facilities management services. Because Pfizer is so huge, they engage with a company called CBRE. CBRE are a global facilities management company. So Pfizer are CBRE to carry out the facilities management for all of their buildings across the world. And CBRE can do that because they are also a multinational company. So the bigger the organization is, the tendency is that that organization would deal with another big organization as their third-party suppliers. Corporates work with corporates. If you're a multinational company, for your IT spend, it's more likely that from a hardware perspective, you're probably dealing with one of the big hardware manufacturers directly without going through a middleman. If you're talking about your in-house software, you're probably dealing with a large multinational like Oracle or SAP, and you're probably working with them directly. You're not working with them through a middleman. Same goes for consumables. If you're and marketing, if you're a regional or large regional or multinational organization, you're probably dealing with a large multinational or large regionally based marketing agency. Same goes for legal services, and same goes for consultancies. For large organizations, they're typically dealing with, your McKinseys or your PwCs or your KPMG or your Ernst & Youngs, okay? Because large organizations tend to then align with large service providers. Okay, so corporates are spending that 70–80% of their spend with other corporates. Okay, that's the reality of where we typically sit with organizations. So now that we know that, let's go on and define what we're talking about here as the subject matter. So if corporates deal with corporates, then what is an SME? What is an SME? So an SME, those three letters actually stand for small, medium-sized business enterprise. Okay, small, medium-sized business enterprise is what an SME is, or a smaller company, not necessarily a small company, but a smaller company than a large multinational, because SMEs have several definitions in different parts of the world and in different industries. But generally speaking, a commonly used description of an SME is an organization with less than 250 employees, less than about 250 million Qatari riyals in terms of turnover. A lot of SMEs will have turnover a lot smaller than that, of course. A lot of SMEs will have a lot less employees, but generally that's a typical threshold that you'll look at to define what are we talking about when we talk about an SME. And they vary in terms of the impact or the treatment of SMEs depending on where you are in the world. So if you look at in Qatar, the statistics show that about 96% of the privately registered organizations in Qatar are defined as SMEs. Okay, so that's a large proportion. If you then look in other parts of the world, you look at other statistics, because if you look at somewhere like the UK or USA, SMEs provide 60 to 80% of all the jobs in those countries. So SMEs together are a big force, and they're very, very important in terms of the sustainability and the economy of any country or any jurisdiction. So 60 to 80% of all jobs are through these types of companies, these small, medium-sized business enterprises. And if you look at, global cities, certain other cities such as Doha, and in this example, in the case of Dubai, then you'll say that the statistics show that 40% of the GDP of those cities come from SMEs. So SMEs are a big force. They're not necessarily small organizations, but they are smaller organizations. They are medium-sized enterprises using those definitions. So that's what we say when we're talking about SMEs. So the question then comes to say, if corporates work with corporates, if the larger the organization or the larger the entity, the likelihood is that they will deal with larger corporates, then why would those corporates then work with an SME? And that's what we need to look at here and see what the benefits are. Now, small to medium business enterprises, by definition, are going to be smaller than those large corporates. So the likelihood is you're going to have less layers of staff. You're going to have, if you're working directly with an SME, the likelihood is that you're working with the owner of that organization, the most senior person in that organization. Okay, so you have that personal involvement from the person who actually owns the company. That's a benefit, rather than working with an organization where you have maybe a mid to senior manager. You're working with a person who actually has ultimate skin in the game. He has a personal interest in delivering the service or the product directly to you. So you have that personal involvement. And due to the fact that SMEs typically have less staff, you're more likely to be dealing with more educated, more experienced, more senior staff when you're working with an SME. There are less staff there, so it's unlikely that you'll be working with a more junior trainee level type of individual. So by inference, one of the benefits of working with SMEs is that you should really be able to be dealing with quite senior people in every transaction that they deal with you. And the other side of it is that SMEs can be a lot more creative, because if you are dealing with the owner, if you are dealing with senior staff, it's more likely that they're able to be more creative and be a little bit more abstract. They're able to think outside of the box, and they have less layers of approvals to go through to deliver that service to you, or to make changes in the service they want to give to you, or to be creative. So that's a benefit of working with SMEs. And that leads to customer focus. So SMEs have more ability to focus on their customer service with you. And of course, finally, just by the nature of being a small to medium enterprise, those organizations do realize that their key is to retain their clients. They have a vested interest, more of a vested interest, to retain you as a business or as a client. So there will be a focus on customer service. There will be a focus on retention. So the inference here is that you should really be getting a better service from SMEs. So that's I guess, a few of the reasons why you would work with SMEs. But the question is how, because we all know that the reality is, why do corporates work with corporates? Because the thinking is that those organizations, those corporates, and as I mentioned before, if Pfizer for their facilities management are working with CBRE, who are a large corporate, then the inference or the understanding is that they have more comfort that that service provider will be able to deliver to the requirements that they actually need. So, and if you look at consultancies, there's always the reticence, I guess, where people think, if I do not appoint a top 4 consultancy firm to carry out the consultancy, then if something goes wrong, then the decision maker is a little bit more exposed than if they appointed KPMG, McKinsey, or Ernst & Young, or one of the big 4 or 5 consultancies out there. There's a little bit of comfort in that large multinational consultancy if you appoint them, than if you went and appointed an SME consultancy. So in that case, to mitigate your risk or to have a bit more comfort, how would you work with SMEs? And the reality is, let's think about it for a second. You need to, if you do want to work with SMEs, and obviously we're advocating that there are instances where you absolutely should do, then you need to have a strategy around it. If you do want to work with SMEs, you need to decide from the start what your strategy is going to be. And part of your strategy could be, am I going to dedicate a percentage of my business to SMEs? Okay, I'm actually going to do that. And if you are, then you should stick to it. As a large organization, if you are a large organization, your strategy could be, right, I'm going to allocate 5% or 15% of all of my third-party spend to SMEs. And once you've made that decision, then you need to create the environment to make sure that SMEs are able to successfully win that business. Okay, so it actually needs to be a bit of positive discrimination, I guess, to a certain extent, a bit of proactiveness to actually say, we are going to award a bit of business to SMEs. And by doing that, then you know that you've actually, I guess, you've actually proactively gone out there to attract SMEs to come and get business from you. Because in the example I gave you before, when we're talking about consultancies, the reality is that as an organization, if you're floating tenders, issuing RFPs for consultancy services, it's going to be very, very difficult for an SME consultant to compete based on your criteria against the big 4 or 5 consultancies. Therefore, you may say, okay, but a percentage of our consultancy work is going to go to an SME, if that's what your strategy is. Or you may decide that there's a category of work that you'll always award to SMEs. You may decide that actually, look, when we're ordering stationery or pens or water or something else, we will not approach multinationals. We will always make sure we work with small or local businesses to provide those particular services. So by doing that, you've already ring-fenced a proportion of your spend to SMEs, and SMEs then have an opportunity to win that part of work. The other bit about how to work with SMEs is an important one, and it says that you can't have standard tender or RFP or invitation to tender documents if you're going to be looking specifically to work with SMEs, because those documents are always going to discriminate against those corporates. They always discriminate in favor of those corporates. They're always going to be geared towards large organizations and not SMEs within those tenders, because the requirements are typically arbitrarily going to be too high in many cases for SMEs to achieve that. So you need to, if your strategy is to work with SMEs, you need to make sure that when you go out to market, you're being realistic about what your requirements are in line with the type of organizations that you're working with. And what do I mean by that? You know, as I said, if you've decided on a category of spend, if you've decided that, right, all of our bottled water for all of our offices across the whole of Doha, we will no longer, or we will not order from multinational companies, we'll order from a local company. Well, then you need to look at some of the requirements you have in place. Maybe tender bond. Do you really need such a high tender bond, service guarantee, things along those lines? Do you need warehousing space? Do you need a lot of things that maybe localized suppliers who can do the work to your quality, maybe they don't have those requirements, so you need to bear that in mind. And finally, once you've got those in place in terms of developing the strategy, you need to have that dialogue with the SME community. You need to have that dialogue with those suppliers, the small to medium enterprises, and make them confident that they can be awarded business. If you've got a strategy where you're awarding a percentage of your work to SMEs, then you need to engage with the community and let them know that there will be an opportunity for them to win, so that they do put in the effort to try and win the business. Otherwise, they will have the inference, or they would assume that actually you're a large organization, you are maybe a large bank, you are QDB, for example. They may have the feeling that they're not going to be successful in a tender, and therefore they won't even put their hat in the ring. They won't even attempt to tender for it. So again, you need to make sure that your strategy is geared towards SMEs if you do want them to win business. So I guess, rounding up, and this is quite a big slide, one of the main reasons people don't work with SMEs is because of the perceived risk. The perceived risk is, I can't work with organizations who are too small. We're not sure about their abilities. I want to get a consultant. This other organization does not have a brand name, does not have a track record that I'm aware of. So if it doesn't go right, how do I mitigate that risk? And the important thing here is that you need to understand what you're looking for, what the capabilities of the person you're working for are. And in many cases, it's worth working to develop that small to medium enterprise. So yes, there are going to be SMEs who don't have corporate services, who don't have centralized functions that you're aware of, who don't have ISO 9000. And if you do want to work with SMEs, it may be worth you actually working with them for them to build up their capabilities in certain areas of which you have an interest. So if you have back office functions, CSR, ethics policies, if you have IT infrastructure, it may be that rather than insisting that a small to medium enterprise has that you either share your infrastructure with them or help them to develop it themselves. You may have a huge supply chain. You may have a logistics network that you have in place due to your large buying power as an organization. You may want to, if you want to work with SMEs, give them access to that so that they're more successful working with you. You can work on training for SMEs. You can provide them with some of the same training that you provide your staff. Again, all of these things will be development opportunities for the SME. And it is great when you start working with an organization, a small to medium enterprise, and over the years, they become bigger and bigger. They are able to work with myriad more organizations, and eventually they perhaps become a multinational themselves, and you've played a big part in developing them as a viable organization. But I think the important thing you need to do while you're doing this is not to give SMEs, not to make them bite off more than they can chew, for want of a better description. So you do need to have continual appraisals and dialogue with SMEs who you work with to make sure that you're not overburdening them with some of your requirements or your demands. Make sure that you have the dialogue to make sure they have the capacity at all times to deliver that. And where they don't have the capacity, you need to work with them to either develop that capacity or to diversify the requirements that you're putting on them. The worst scenario you can get into is where you're working with an SME, you are their biggest client, or you are delivering, a huge proportion, maybe 90% of their revenue. That will not necessarily work in the favor of the SME in the long run. because they have an over-reliance on you as an organization to survive. Therefore, you need to work with them to diversify or make sure that you don't make up too much of a proportion of this spend, because it can be detrimental in the long run. So the important thing here is that when you're working with SMEs, that you do exactly that. You work with them, and you work with them on a regular basis. So just to finish off, how would you work with SME? You should really make sure it's part of your strategy. Okay, make sure you have a strategy of working with SMEs, and that could be anything. If you're corporate, you could have a strategy of working with SMEs in a certain category. If you're a government entity, it could be a government directive. I mean, a government directive to work with local suppliers is an SME strategy in effect. So if you have a strategy to actually develop local capabilities in your jurisdiction, in a city, town, or regionally, then you have a duty to work with SMEs and to develop them, because that's doing a world of good for the city, country, or region that you're in, and it's helping to develop the economy by working with SMEs, and it's also helping to mitigate your risks in terms of local sourcing. So ensure it's part of your strategy. Make sure that you're engaging with SMEs for the right commodity or service. There may be services that it's appropriate to award part of the work to an SME, but not all of it. Make sure that your pre-qualification is not too high of a hurdle that an SME can never jump over that hurdle. If you want to work with SMEs in that category, you need to think about how you're going to assess their bids. Don't put unrealistic expectations in front of SMEs. Do you need to help them? Have you put some quite high IT requirements in your documents, which may preclude small to medium enterprises from actually engaging with you in the first place? And finally, you need to make sure that you're not making SMEs overcommit. So you don't really want to be the vast majority of their income because you're putting them at risk. You're better off working to help them to diversify whatever service they're delivering to you, rather than having an over-reliance on you. So that really covers the main things in terms of working with SMEs. I think from a procurement perspective, that is a really broad brush of how to work with SMEs. I think the main thing will be to hear from some of you to understand some of the nuances, some of the issues that you may have, and I'm happy to take any questions. So back over to Rao, and I'll stay here and take any questions that may come across. Rao, are you still there?
Absolutely, Sam. It's been so informative. In fact, we were lost in the information. It was so structured, and I could see all of us were really engrossed into it. Not many questions, and it was crystal clear. The message was very, very clear as to what we should be looking for the SMEs and what our organization should plan for. And the actual word which you use, CSR, we really like it, Sam. Thank you so much for explaining it. And now it's time for our question and answer session, and we've got quite some attendees today. Some of them are like very familiar people. I can see Mr. Mayur Londe here, Abhimanyu Arora, Shadab, Mr. Rahul Deshmukh. Thanks for taking out the time and attending the session today. Of course, we've got Mr. Apurva Kumar Modi, of course, a very popular name, Modi, when we say it. Ghazala, thank you for joining us today, and just trying to kill some time before we get into the question and answer session. Sam has been speaking continuously, so this will act as icebreaker. So people who have not yet formed their questions, they can form it. Kennedy, we see you. Thank you for coming in. Lawrence, thanks for attending it. I know you've been busy throughout the day. Taha, Mukhatil, thank you. Mr. Tamimi is here, and Mohammad Farhan. Then goes Mr. Nitesh Raj. Sorry, I'm not reading everybody's name, but just to encourage you guys, please do attend these sessions. It's very informative and knowledge sharing sessions. The information shared by Mr. Sam, you will not find it in any book. I bet you about that. So these are like, rather than reading 5 or 10 books, please attend one session and you can really grab a lot of information, which would benefit you in your day-to-day job. Ms. Ria Philip, I can see you there. Sana Siddiq is here. Talib Hussain, Umar Raghib is here. Vanita Iyer, Zafar Khan, thanks for coming in. Now we'll jump on to our question and answer session. I can see some questions already raised, but Sam, let me start with a question from my side. Should we say that you mentioned a few points about it, saying there should be a CSR and some allocation. should large organizations possibly discriminate in favor of SMEs? And if so, what do you think is the benchmark across the world? Like you have seen the world over saying many countries have implemented it. What should be the percentage? When we say percentage, should we go for value, volume, or complexity? We would like to hear more from you, please.
That's a great question, and yeah, it depends on everything you just said. So it depends on where you are in the world, what the commodity of spend is, and what the priorities are. So generally, I think if you're in a developing country, a lot of developing countries have governmental objectives in terms of building up the local economy. So so government spend will actually be ordered in certain ways to be directed towards SMEs, because that builds up the local economy. That builds up the amount, the money going around in the local economy rather than going out of the country. So if you're in that kind of scenario, then if you're in a government entity in a developing country, then typically these regions have strong SME policies, which say you should really work with local organizations, and therefore if you're going to divert spend, then you should divert it to local organizations. And it's going to depend on what that spend is. You know, IT is a spend that sometimes can't be localized because it relies on multinationals, but IT implementers or implementation organizations can be local. So that talks about where you can have a category of spend that maybe can't be localized, but you can have a subcategory that can be localized. So organizations that or jurisdictions that are looking to build the local economy have a real incentive to aim towards SMEs. So that's government. But then you talk about large multinationals who have a corporate social responsibility to give back to communities or give back to small organizations in general. So that's when you start talking about allocating percentage of spend. You start looking at areas of spend that are relevant to small, medium enterprises, and from a CSR, from a responsibility perspective, you then award those kinds of tenders to SMEs. But I think finally, look, sustainability is a big thing these days. The whole subject of sustainability, and that's where the whole corporate social responsibility thing gets intertwined with environmental concerns, because local sourcing obviously reduces carbon footprint, and it means that really there's an added incentive to be working with organizations as locally as possible. And one thing that COVID-19 taught us was that you can't really spread essential services too wide around the world, because once supply chains are affected, you suddenly wish you had local expertise to deal with your requirements. So I hope that answers some of your question.
No, it was very clear, Sam. In fact, thank you so much for answering. We will take on the questions from you. I have a first question from Mr. Ala Al-Tahir. I have a strange experience with one small SME, and we can watch them grow bigger and more professional. So my question is, does teaching them worth the efforts?
Yeah, I think, and it's a good question. Is it worth the effort? Absolutely. Now, and obviously it depends what your overall incentive and outcome is. So if it's from a CSR perspective and you've grown a local company through your own efforts, then yeah, from a corporate social responsibility perspective, it's great. I think if your objective is to grow an organization is to increase your own profits, then if that's your overriding objective, then you may not always meet that. But I think if you're prioritizing SMEs, then you have to make sure it follows an objective of yours. So where you find, in certain cities and certain government entities have, SME divisions or SME departments, they know that that's a long-term outcome. They know that it's a long-term effort to build local capacity, local capability, and the local economy. So they're not looking for payback on that within the short term, but within the longer term, a strategy that focuses on SMEs is going to be building up your country.
Yeah, I've just noticed people are writing in the chat box. Any questions, please raise it in the Q&A, please. Not in the chat box, so we'll not be able to see that. Here it's very clear. Second question, Sam, it's from Mahmood. He's asking, can you give an example of developing a strategy for previous slide? So which previous slide he's referring to? I'm slightly lost here.
So I think it may be, I think I put some points around developing a strategy for SMEs. And there are some considerations. And of course, we'll be happy to share the slides and some other links after this session. But if you're developing a strategy, you need to be clear on what you're trying to do here. So if your strategy is from a CSR perspective, then you should really say we're going to allocate a proportion of our spend to SMEs and make sure that you've got a strategy to meet that. You should perhaps identify the categories of spend that are going to be relevant to SMEs and maybe ring fence that spend so that it's only ever going to be awarded to SMEs. So when you're sending out tenders for that category of spend, and as I said, it could be anything from the supply of water to the supply of pens, stationery, to IT implementation. Once you ring fence that, you say, and therefore we will only ever give that to SMEs. And then your strategy will also be to review your documentation when you go out to tender, your requirements. Are your requirements that go out to the market fit for purpose for SMEs, or do they automatically discriminate against SMEs? So those are the overarching things to consider when you're putting together your SME strategy.
Thank you so much, Sam. I think the main point is that the category manager holds the key, saying that what is the complexity of the item and how we can drive it further, saying that what portion of it can be localized or can be driven to an SME. So I think all the professionals are here with us today, and we request all category managers to review their plans and definitely allocate certain percentage. And whoever is in Qatar, if you need some help in identifying whoever is an SME, you can always approach QDB, and they've got a very good publishing. It guides you as to who is what and what do they do. And in case they need to increase the capabilities also, QDB is willing to encourage such small and medium enterprises. So that's Mohammed, from your side, we've been advocating also on behalf of QDB. Next question, again from Mr. Alal Tahir. Also, there is no clear limit for teaching them how to work. Example, how to submit a perfect offer, how to communicate, write polite emails, etc. Well, and I think that's a universal issue, what we have in Mr. Tahir. Before Mr. Sam answers, thanks to QDB, they did conduct a session for all the SMEs, if I'm not wrong, 4 months back. It was how to register and how to keep this particular relationship active. And this was based on a model called Carter's 10C model. It's a beneficial model. In fact, this is a challenge, whether it is an SME or a regular supplier. We all face in the procurement field on these things. Sam, would you like to add anything on it?
No, I think you're absolutely right. There's no limit to the amount of assistance and development you can give to SMEs. You know, if you have the capacity and capability yourself. The reality is, what you don't want to do is you don't want to preclude or discriminate against SMEs from having the opportunity to win a tender because of things like them being unable to write an email, as was the example, or to submit a bid. If you find that being a problem, then it's probably worth working with them to develop that capability. And that comes through dialogue. You know, before you send this tender out to the market, maybe have a few pre-tender meetings with prospective tenderers to make sure that everyone is on the same page, to make sure they do understand, to make sure they know what they need to submit, to make sure they know how to be compliant, so they don't preclude themselves from the tender before they enter the tender. So I think it's certainly, if you have an SME priority and you have an SME strategy, then you need to follow it through, and you need to then be prepared to invest the time to give the SMEs every opportunity to be successful in earning business from you.
Thank you, Sam. We have one more question. Of course, it's from anonymous attendee. I think it's already addressed, but let's read it again. Do you see localization versus globalization sharing change this time of pandemic? So they're talking about the ratio, or do you believe it will be more of localization for SME support now?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting thing. Look, there's definitely is an acceleration to the trend towards localization as a result of COVID. And of course, there are some commodities of spend that there's more of an urgency to localize. You know, food security, If you look at the region we're in, food security becomes more and more essential now because of the effects of COVID, where many countries in this region maybe had 6 months worth of food security, and those plans will be revisited as a result of COVID. So categories of spend like food security, medical supplies, the requirement for them to be not just stored locally, but to be manufactured locally, there'll be more of a focus. But generally, I think for any commodity, people will pay a lot more attention to risk mitigation. There'll be a lot more varied risk. There'll be a lot less sole sourcing. There'll be a lot less reliance on a single part of the world, whether that's China or someone else. People will start to spread the risk a lot wider to make sure that they have a mixture of local capability, whether that's sourcing or manufacturing, and from a longer term perspective, they will then be entering supply chains to order things from faraway places. But the move previously was global sourcing. Let's go as far away as possible because it seems as if you're getting the best value. But what was missing was the risk management and the supply chain management. And I think COVID in one fell swoop reminded people that you always have to diversify your risk. That's an essential part of procurement in any case.
Thank you, Sam. I've got one more question from, I think, Mr. Monir Ibrahim. Some SME companies, they request many inquiries in pre-qualification. Yeah, that's more like information and the question. Mr. Monir, if you would like to complete the question, you can retype it and then we'll try to answer it. I'll move to the next question by Mr. Anish Kumar. The most common hurdle corporates experience while dealing with SMEs are the perceived risks. How can we as procurement professionals strive to reduce or mitigate these risks?
There's a common saying that I've often heard where people say no one ever got fired for hiring McKinsey. It's the typical thing where, look, you're dealing with global brands who have a almost like a track record and a brand name, and you would really be taking a risk if you did not go in certain categories of spend with those suppliers. So how do you mitigate those risks? We go back to what we said before. First of all, you make sure that internally and externally, you have an SME strategy. So if you're ring fencing a certain category of spend to SMEs, then you've already committed to working with SMEs in that category. Second of all, you have to keep dialogue open with SMEs. You probably need to do that more than larger corporates, because you need to keep that dialogue going. You need to understand whether risks are developing within the SME, whether they are over capacity, whether they're becoming too reliant on you as a single client, whether they need any help from you, whether they're going to be able to deliver on the promises they've made you. Because if you're a large organization and an SME is dealing with you, then they're going to be very, very reluctant to say to you that they cannot deliver something, because that could jeopardize the contract they have with you. So you have to work closely with them. You need to understand the situation. And by doing those things, looking at the category of spend, developing the SME and having a strategy that ring fences certain categories, you can certainly start to mitigate a lot of that risk.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much. I've got a question from Daniel Ulum. How do you deal with capacity-related issues? You give business and the supplier is really struggling in a way or another, maybe financially or technically. Assistance in the aspect would look like you are actually doing the job yourself and you don't want audit queries. How would you advise to go about that? Wow, very practical question.
Yeah, that's a good one, Daniel. And look, no one wants audit queries. Let's face it. That's what we don't come out with, and that's why it's very important to have an SME strategy so that everyone in an organization is on the same page. I think I said at the start that it's very often that organizations who have a procurement strategy don't align that strategy with the organization strategy. Your procurement strategy has to be entwined with your organization strategy at all time. So if the organization strategy is we are going to work for a proportion of our spend or in a specific category with SMEs, then everyone is on board, including audit. and we understand what we're getting into. Now, working with SMEs may require a lot of development. You may need to work hand in hand with them. You may need to support them. If you think about something as simple as payment terms, during COVID, there's a lot of organizations around the world who started having zero payment terms with their suppliers. They started paying upon delivery of items, not 30 days, not 90 days, because what you don't want to do with, especially SMEs, is to start adversely affecting their cash flow, because they have less ability to withstand that. So you may decide with SMEs to have a much different set of payment terms. Maybe paying advance, maybe paying in advance of commodities, and therefore you're not affecting their cash flow, because you already know that they are SMEs. You may need to structure your support around that. You may know that they don't have certain IT systems. You may know that they don't have that infrastructure. You may want to share some IT infrastructure with them. You may want to share your IT expertise, your IT technicians. You may want to share warehousing space with them. You may want to let them use your warehousing facilities at your own cost. So you factor all of those things in, and you give SMEs every opportunity to succeed in working with you, but it has to be aligned to your strategy so you don't get those audit queries.
Thank you, Sam. I think at the end of the day, we need to draw a line saying that this is what we can do or extend help, and not go beyond that. Yeah. It should not look like just supporting them too many things, and it may be impacting your competition as well. So yeah,
well, absolutely. The reality is that, look, you are typically, if you take a view on working with SMEs, it is a different relationship in many ways. In many ways, you are working in a developmental mode to assist those SMEs in becoming bigger and better, more sophisticated organizations.
I've got a good question from Sana Sadiq. In fact, it's more of a general, not only to the SME. In the start, Sam, you have mentioned organizational strategy should be aligned with procurement strategy. There are often times when an organization wants to enhance their brand presence, and yet they want to spend less, resulting in the pressure on procurement manager to get some top quality services as well as least possible cost. I mean, that's the general rule, no? Which we all are surviving with that. How should we deal with this kind of scenario? This is not pertaining to an SME procurement, but a general one. Thanks.
Yeah, it's a good question, and that's where, look, the organizations and that dialogue, or that relationship between procurement and the organization in general needs to be enhanced. The biggest requirement, or the biggest skill, or the biggest tool in the toolbox of a senior procurement leader in this day and age, as I always say, are not those technical skills of negotiation or anything along those lines. It's actually the soft skills in being able to influence your stakeholders. Especially your internal stakeholders. You need to be able to articulate what value procurement can bring to your internal stakeholders for procurement to be effective. So you shouldn't get to a scenario where an organization's strategy is saying we want to grow brand presence, but we want to do it for the lowest price, because that doesn't really make, from an articulation perspective, it doesn't really ring true. The definition of procurement is to obtain goods and services for the lowest total cost of ownership, not lowest price. And if you're able to articulate that to your stakeholders, then the better, because if you're talking about marketing services, then the lowest price is not necessarily the one that's going to give you the best service. As an example, and actually that's not just in relation to marketing, that's in relation to most categories of spend. So you need to be able to articulate how you're evaluating the services you're bringing along, what your ratio is between the technical aspects, the quality aspects against the commercial aspects, and make sure that everyone's on board when they're evaluating, and maybe disqualifying the commercial aspects of bids that do not meet your service requirements. So again, from a procurement leadership perspective, you need to be able to articulate that to the wider organization to be as effective as you can as a procurement person.
Thank you, Sam. Sam, I think we still have 8 or 9 more questions. Seems like everybody, as I told you, everybody was so engrossed into it, they've really absorbed it, and now they're coming up with the questions. We really appreciate your patience. Just a few more questions, please.
Oh, go ahead.
The next is from Nitesh Raj. Thank you, Sam, for bringing out the importance of SME in an economy. Thank you. Can you please advise the procurement challenges of new SME in Qatar when they deal with the supplier?
I think, look, the new SMEs, that's where the supply development comes into it. If you are a new SME, then you're really in, from a disadvantaged perspective, you're really in the most disadvantaged position in terms of being successful in winning tenders, especially if it's with a large corporate, unless those organizations have specific strategies and work with SMEs. And why is that? Because the evaluation process you're not going to be able to show a track record in terms of your brand name, in terms of your financial stability, in terms of your previously successful projects. So you're really in a starting position, in a difficult position in terms of building up your presence and winning tenders. So SMEs trying to get on the market in anywhere, whether it's in Doha, whether it's in Qatar, or it's in other parts of the world, makes it very, very difficult. So you have to be realistic, and I would say you seek out the entities, the organizations, whether they're governmental or multinationals, who have specific SME policies or strategies that are going to enable you to build up your business. If it's a government department that has a quota of services that they're going to give to SMEs, or a larger corporate who have a CSR strategy, you need to make sure you're close to industry, you understand these things, you understand who these entities are, and you start to try and establish a track record with them. And that will help you grow as an SME. And it'll save you time and effort and frustration from going to other entities where you're not going to be as successful.
Sam, the next question, thank you, Sam. This next question is from Prem Thakur. SME should be expert of that commodity or any senior person from partner end? Okay,
in terms of, I didn't quite understand the question. Was that a question or was that a statement?
I found it more like a statement saying that, okay, or maybe he's trying to ask a question saying that, do they have to be an expert of the commodity, or any partnership firm can be an SME? I think for the SME definition, you already given it saying that what could be an SME to it, huh?
Yeah, I think no, I think you're right. Look, there is an element here where are we asking whether we reduce the quality requirements of an organization in order to work with an SME. And I have to be clear that actually you're not doing that at all. You're actually not doing that at all. So if you want to work with an SME who's a consultant, for example, you want to use that local SME rather than McKinsey as an example, and I always use McKinsey, generic example. It doesn't mean you're lowering the quality. No one's saying to anyone you should compromise on the quality of the consultancy services you're receiving. In fact, you should still hold the supply to the same standard.
Yep.
What we're saying about working with SMEs is you should just bear in mind that there will be certain things that they may not have in place over and above the actual service they're delivering. So if an SME is delivering bottled water to you, they still need to deliver bottled water to the quality and compliance as anybody else, any large multinational who's going to supply that. But it just may be that they don't have acres and acres of storage facilities. They don't have a nationwide logistics hub. They're unable to deliver it, a consignment to you within 30 minutes because they're just not that big. But the actual commodity, you should never compromise on that. That's not the reason to work with SMEs. So going back to the question, yes, an SME should and will be a subject matter expert in whatever they're doing. Otherwise, they're not really an organization who you should be considering. You're not working with SMEs for the sake of it. You're working with SMEs only because you're recognizing that there are certain things over and above the product or service that they're unable to provide.
Very true, Sam. Thank you so much for your insight. Sam, there are still so many questions popping up. I think we'll take only a few. I can see you're already tired after a long day. And even our attendees also, there's still 60 attendees still onto the screen. They're asking a lot of questions. I'll pick a few, Sam, and the others, maybe we can send them an email. Do you agree with that?
Sure,
Yeah?
absolutely.
Okay. I'll just raise one question. This is from Abdullah Ahmed Adam. He has asked a question: what strategy is appropriate for spend management in sole proprietorship business when the owner does not care about procedures but thinks pricing should be based on the cheapest product quality? Ahmed, and is written from Ghana.
Yeah, so I wonder here if we're talking about the sole proprietorship being the SME, but look, again, I'll just reiterate what I said before. If you are engaged with an SME, it's still about the product or service, and the product or service should still be of that quality. Now, if we're talking about this particular SME, and I'm assuming here, maybe cutting corners on the manufacturing process or anything relating to the product, then you'll start to think whether they are actually fit for purpose to be a provider to you. So really SMEs should be able to provide the same quality, and they should be able to do it for a more convenient price, maybe because they don't have overheads, but they won't have the corporate backing, maybe the financial track record, etc. But certainly when you're procuring from SMEs, it's never in any procurement sense only going to be about price. You still need to hold them to account for the quality of service and the quality of product as well.
Thank you, Sam. There is a question from anonymous attorney. I will take this, Sam, if you don't mind. When you say SME, is it only locally manufactured items, or can it also be outsourced item service? Or is it only based on size, like number of employees and turnover value? Typically, when we are saying SMEs, there is a set criteria defined. And in the state of Qatar, Qatar Development Bank, along with the Ministry of Finance, has already defined the criteria, saying the number of employees should be less than 250. The turnover should not be more than 100 million per annum. The assets should be only 50 million. So once they qualify into this particular criteria, they will be known as an SME, and that too local manufacturing itself. Or else all the traders would come and register as an SME where there is nothing actually being produced locally. Yeah. Thank you so much. That's then. And then we have another question from Ms. Iman Abdul Malik. In general, what kind of documents we can request from suppliers to verify that they are SME? Two things are there. One, you can refer to the book published by the Qatar Development Bank. It has details of the SME. In case if you're in doubts, you can always ask them the same questions. That is the criteria set by the government, saying how many employees they have, what is the turnover, what is the number of assets they have in the particular product. And then yes, once they match the criteria, then that helps you to verify they are an SME. Or the easiest way is, please write an email to Qatar Development Bank. They will confirm if they are an SME or not. I've got one generic question from Mohammed Roman. Are you all aware about the global freight shipping crisis? Any nearby solution? Wow, that's a very broad question. Thank you so much for raising it up. I've been checking with the industry experts right across the sea freight, not only in Doha, even in Dubai and other Middle East regions and all. It is not linked to a company or a country, but a global chaos affected by the pandemic. Industry experts, the Drewry reports and all, they say it will continue up to March 2022. So yeah, immediate solution is go for the spot rates and try to get a best shipping line. That's the way we can handle it. Ishwar Padmanabhan says, are we going to see a proliferation of SMEs towards the growth of industry and economy? Sam, would you like to answer that, please?
Yeah, I mean, if strategies are geared towards SMEs, if strategies are positively discriminating towards SMEs and incentivizing companies to develop SMEs, then yes, we will get a proliferation. We've seen some of the statistics I gave at the start. You get certain areas of the world or the region where you're looking at 40–50% of GDP is made up by SMEs, and that really is healthy. So you can look at statistics that say 96% or 98% of organizations are SMEs. That's good, but then that also needs to follow with the percentage of GDP they're providing, and also importantly, the percentage of employment they're providing. And I think we use the example of the United States or the UK, where it's 60 to 80% of employees work with SMEs. So yes, if strategies go towards incentivizing SME development, then there certainly will be a proliferation over and above the number of SMEs. There should be a proliferation in the number of people SMEs are providing as well.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much. I've got a question from Mr. Mayur Londe. Is it wise to work with SME if it's only a distributor of the product? That is, the product is manufactured out of base. Is it worth the effort to assist the SME? I think
so. It's the old OEM type answer, and I mean it all depends. I mean,
yeah.
Sometimes you have SMEs are the local distributor or local kind of franchise owner for the larger brand, and they have the local knowledge. And if you try to work with the global parent, you'll have less response time, less knowledge. So yeah, in those cases where they are the appointed representative, then absolutely work with the SME. They are the middleman. And even if you look at IT services, I see several examples of IT implementers of representing large IT organizations who are very, very successful, and they are the best people to engage with to implement the IT system, even though they're an SME rather than going to the parent company. So yeah, definitely if you're talking about an appointee of a large multinational, then there's absolutely no reason why you shouldn't engage with them.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much. I've got one question from Talib. I will answer it if you don't mind. He is asking, an SME might represent a higher financial risk than a big supplier. What are the factors to be taken into consideration as part of the financial due diligence? Mr. Talib, typically when we are looking at an SME, you need to look at it from 7 different perspectives. I'm not referring to the 6 thinking hats model, but something similar. You need to look at their competence, scalability, quality, reliability, consistency, sustainability, and check if they are doing it in an ethical manner. Once you cover these 7 different elements, I'm sure Sam will agree saying that then we will really come up with a competent SME who can support your company. So please do not take the risks. Please do take only the mitigated risks into it by assessing all these factors.
Yeah, I'd 100% agree, Rao, and I'll add a further one to that, is that you need to be realistic, and you need to do your own assessment. SMEs by nature, especially if you're a large organization, will be happy to provide services to you, but you have a responsibility to make sure that you are not overcommitting them. So talking about the financial risk here, if an SME is providing services to you and they have turnover of 100,000 riyals, and the services that if they have existing turnover of 100,000 riyals, and the services they're providing to you are, I don't know, let's say another 100,000 riyals, then what you're saying is that you are doubling their business. Okay, you're doubling their business. So that's good in one way, but the flip side is that you're potentially putting them at risk, because they would have scaled up to be able to fulfill your requirements, and you represent 50% of their business. Now, typically, that's probably okay, but you shouldn't really be going over 50, 60, 70, 80% of an SME's business as their sole source of income. You as an organization should not be representing that percentage of their business, because what that means is that if you don't decide to work with them in a year's time or 2 years' time, then you would automatically cripple their business once you walk away. So part of your due diligence should be finding out what percentage, once you enter into the contract, what percentage of their business do you represent? And you need to be looking at mitigating those risks. And mitigating those risks don't mean we're not doing business with you because we represent too much. You need to start looking at areas where you can support them in mitigating that exposure that you represent as a single client.
Thank you, Sam. Truly appreciate it. Sam, I think it's already, we have surpassed our set time. Still have 2 more questions. So
sure, let's go for them. Let's go for them. Yeah.
All right. Thanks, Sam. This is from Monir Ibrahim. He's saying that some SME companies require many requirements in pre-qualification. So the suppliers became bored and not interested to make a deal. So how can procurement deal with that?
So I think, as I said before, the important thing is that if you do want to work with SMEs, then you need to look at things like your pre-qualification to make sure that they are relevant to SMEs. So, or relevant to whatever supply base you're going out to. Don't ask for things that are realistic. You know, you're not dumbing down the requirements, but you're just making sure that they're realistic. So, you know, don't be sending something out there that you know that suppliers are not going to respond to, because it doesn't help either party. So gear your procurement towards SMEs if that's what your strategy is.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much. Sam, I have the last question here. It is about communicating with the SMEs. This is from an anonymous attendee. He says that for government, SME procurement in our country is clear, as they have directives that certain commodities have to be procured from local companies or SMEs. But our company as a multinational does both local and international procurement. How do we make SMEs understand our procurement strategy and not think that we are not supporting them?
Okay, that's an interesting question, because I mean, if you're in a country which says certain spend has to go to SMEs, then it's difficult for you to deviate from the country's priorities. It depends whether it's a priority or a law, but essentially, look, wherever you are, you need to be working to the spirit of that country's procurement rules. So if you have global sourcing, but you're in a jurisdiction that says for certain commodities to spend, you should spend that locally, then you need to look at how to do that locally. You need to look at what partners you can engage with to provide or to obtain those goods and services locally. And they will be there. And if they're not, then obviously you'll have some exemptions. But it's the whole global approach. If you're a multinational, there's a lot of things you'll be doing globally, but you will also need to bear in mind that there are some things that are going to be relevant locally, and you need to do your best to adhere to them, because that's not only CSR, it's not only good practice, but a lot of the times it's also being compliant.
Thank you, Sam. Thank you so much. With that, Sam, I think we answered most of the queries. I think the last 90 minutes have been very, very informative. The presentation was one part, the question and answer was the best part of it. And I would like to thank Sam and QDB for the opportunity and presenting this event, the entire CIPS Qatar branch team and our MENA coordination as well. Let me acknowledge the efforts of Ms. Dana. She's been pretty helpful in the coordination part into it, and all the attendees, participants, thank you so much for attending it. And do not miss our next event. Very soon it's going to be advertised. And believe you me, please be always updated. If you're not updated, you're outdated. So these sessions will help you in getting together. And CIPS believes in promoting and sharing the knowledge. We look forward to seeing you all at our next session. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Mohammed. We truly appreciate it. And thank you to all the participants again. Have a nice evening. And please remember, before I conclude, we are only volunteers here. We have got our own daytime jobs. Yes, it's a passion to promote the procurement standards and all, and we'll continue to do so. Thanks to you, Sam.
Thank you all. Take care, everyone.